The cold night air bit into Celeste's skin as she stepped out of the Montgomery estate for what might be the last time. The weight of her decision pressed heavily on her chest, but she forced herself to keep walking. Her car was waiting at the curb, packed with nothing but a suitcase and a duffel bag. Everything else, her designer clothes, the expensive jewelry, the life of privilege, had been left behind. With trembling fingers, she gripped her phone and dialed the one person who mattered now.
Jax.
The phone rang twice before his deep, familiar voice answered. Celeste? It's late, what's? I left, she whispered, cutting him off. I left my family. A beat of silence. Then, where are you? On my way to you. She hung up before he could protest. The drive to Jax's small apartment above the auto shop felt like an eternity. Her heart pounded with equal parts excitement and fear. She had chosen him. She had walked away from everything for this man. Would he still want her now? When she finally pulled up outside the garage, the lights in his apartment were still on. The moment she stepped out of the car, the front door opened, and Jax appeared, barefoot, wearing nothing but sweatpants and a plain t-shirt. His brows were furrowed, his expression unreadable. Celeste barely had time to take a breath before he was in front of her. You actually did it, he murmured, his gaze searching hers. She nodded. I told you I would. Jax exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Damn, Celeste. A small, nervous laugh escaped her. You could sound a little happier about it. At that, he let out a low chuckle and pulled her into his arms. She melted against his warmth, feeling, for the first time that night, like she had made the right choice. You're insane, he muttered into her hair. But you're mine now, huh? Yours, she echoed, pressing her face against his chest. For the first time in hours, she felt safe. But that peace didn't last long. Jax led her inside, closing the door behind them. She set her bags down, scanning the small but cozy apartment she had visited only a handful of times. It was a stark contrast to the lavish mansion she had grown up in, but she didn't care. Are you sure about this? Jax asked, watching her carefully. You can't go back, Celeste. They're not going to forgive this. She met his gaze, determination shining in her eyes. I don't want to go back. I want to be here, with you. He was quiet for a long moment before he sighed, shaking his head. You're something else, princess. She smiled, but just as she opened her mouth to respond, something caught her eye, a sleek black briefcase sitting on the small kitchen table. It wasn't Jax's usual style. And next to it, a crisp white envelope with the Montgomery family crest stamped into the wax seal. Her heart stopped. Slowly, she turned back to Jax, her voice barely above a whisper. Jax, what is this? His jaw tensed. Celeste, don't. She didn't listen. Her hands trembled as she reached for the envelope, breaking the seal before he could stop her. Inside was a check. A check made out to Jackson Carter. For $500,000. Her blood ran cold. What the hell is this? She demanded, her voice shaking. Jax ran a hand through his hair, looking away. It's not what you think. It looks like my family paid you to stay away from me. They did.
His voice was low.
And I didn't take it. Her hands curled around the check. Then why do you have it? Jax sighed. Because I wanted to prove something to you. Prove what? That your family was right about me. The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. What? Jax finally met her gaze, and for the first time since she had met him, there was no teasing smile, no cocky charm. Just cold, hard truth. I didn't come into your life by accident, Celeste. Her stomach dropped. What are you saying? I knew who you were the second you walked into my shop. He exhaled heavily. At first, yeah, I saw an opportunity. But then, I fell for you. I really did. But it started as a lie. Silence. Celeste's heart shattered. Oh my God. She had walked away from her entire life for this man. And he hadn't even been real. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Do you honestly believe he's with you for love? Jax stepped forward, reaching for her. But she stumbled back, shaking her head. Don't touch me. Celeste, please. You knew who I was. From the beginning. And you still let me think. She swallowed hard, her throat burning. You let me think I was choosing you. You were, he said desperately. I never took their money, Celeste. I never betrayed you. I love you. But the damage was done. Celeste let out a shaky breath, tears stinging her eyes. I gave up everything for you. Jax looked wrecked, his hands clenched at his sides. And I didn't ask you to. That hurt more than anything. She had fought for him, chosen him, and now she had nowhere left to go. Without another word, Celeste turned on her heel and walked out the door. Jax didn't stop her. He couldn't, because he knew she might never come back. The cold air stung her skin as Celeste stepped out of Jax's apartment. The door slammed shut behind her, but she didn't flinch. She just stood there, staring at the empty street, her heart pounding in her chest. She had nowhere to go. Her family had shut her out. Jax had lied to her. And now she was alone. The weight of it all crashed over her at once. A bitter laugh escaped her lips, raw and broken. She had been so stupid, so naive. I left everything for him, and he was never mine to begin with. Her hands clenched at her sides, the check still gripped between her fingers. The check that proved her family had tried to buy Jax off. And the confession that proved he had known exactly who she was before she had even spoken his name. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. You're throwing everything away for a fantasy. Maybe he had been right, but she had made her choice. And she wasn't going back. With a deep breath, she forced herself to move. She walked to her car, tossed the check onto the passenger seat, and climbed in. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay there. Her fingers hovered over her phone screen. She had no friends outside of her family circle, no one she could call for help. The realization made her stomach turn. You really gave up everything, didn't you? Her eyes burned, but she refused to cry. Not here.
Not now.
She started the car and drove. Hours passed before Celeste finally pulled into a cheap motel parking lot on the outskirts of town. It was a far cry from the five-star hotels she had grown up in, but none of that mattered anymore. She paid for a room in cash, what little she had left, and stepped inside, locking the door behind her. The room was small, barely furnished, with peeling wallpaper and a flickering lamp. She sank onto the bed, staring at the ceiling. Everything had changed in the span of a single night. Her family,
Jax,
her entire life. Celeste let out a shaky breath and pulled the crumpled check from her pocket, staring at her father's signature at the bottom. $500,000. Jax hadn't taken it, but he had thought about it, and that was enough. Anger surged in her chest, not just at Jax, but at herself, for believing in him, for being foolish enough to think love could be enough. No more. She had spent her entire life being controlled by her family, by expectations, by love. Never again. Slowly, she reached into her bag and pulled out a lighter. With a flick, the small flame danced in the dim room. She held the check over it, watching as the edges curled and blackened. The flames licked hungrily at the paper, consuming the last remnants of the life she had left behind. She didn't need their money. She didn't need them. As the ashes crumbled onto the floor, Celeste closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she would start over. Alone. But for the first time in her life, free. Jax stood in his apartment, staring at the door she had just walked out of. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw tight. He had let her go, because he had no choice. He scrubbed a hand down his face, pacing across the small space. He hadn't wanted this. He hadn't meant for this to happen. But she had found the check, and there was no coming back from that. A bitter laugh escaped him. Damn Montgomerys. Always controlling everything. They had never trusted him. And maybe they had been right not to. But what they didn't know, what Celeste didn't know, was that Jax had never intended to take their money. He had come into her life with an agenda, yes. But that had been before he had fallen for her. Before she had made him believe he could be something more than the man they thought he was. And now she was gone. Jax turned toward the table, his eyes darkening as they landed on the second envelope he hadn't dared to show her. The one with his family name stamped into the wax seal. His father's name. The man who had ruined his life. Jax clenched his fists. Celeste thought she was the only one who had walked away from a powerful family. But she wasn't the only one with secrets. And soon, she would find out the truth. Celeste woke up in a stiff motel bed, her body aching from exhaustion, but sleep had done little to quiet her mind. The events of the past night replayed in her head, over and over like a cruel reminder. She had walked away from everything. Her family.
Jax.
And now she had nothing. For a moment, she lay there, staring at the water-stained ceiling. The old Celeste, the heiress, the perfect Montgomery daughter, would have panicked, would have called home, apologized, begged for another chance. But that girl was gone. With a deep breath, she pushed herself up and reached for her phone. The battery was almost dead, but she had enough charge left to do what needed to be done. Her father had called 3 times. Her mother, once. There were no messages, just silence. She deleted them all. Then, her fingers hovered over Jax's name. A part of her wanted to call, wanted to demand answers, wanted to scream at him for breaking her heart. But another part of her, the stronger part, knew there was no point. She had to let him go. With a deep breath, she blocked his number. For good. Jax stood in his garage, his hands covered in grease, but his mind was miles away. She was gone. He had known Celeste wouldn't forgive him easily. But the way she had looked at him last night, like he was just another lie in her life, stung deeper than he wanted to admit. He had let her believe the worst about him because it was easier than telling her the truth. That he wasn't just some mechanic from the wrong side of town. That his past was far more complicated than she knew. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and when he saw the caller ID, his stomach twisted. His father. The man he had spent years trying to outrun. Jax clenched his jaw and answered. What do you want? A low chuckle came through the line. You really think you can ignore me forever, son? Jax's grip tightened on the phone. I told you, I'm done with you. Are you? His father's voice was smooth, amused. Then why did you refuse the check? Jax stiffened. His father chuckled. The Montgomerys thought they could buy you off. And you let the girl walk away instead. Interesting choice, son. Jax gritted his teeth. Stay out of this. Oh, but it's already too late. His father's voice darkened. You think Celeste is the only one with a powerful family? You think you can keep your past buried? Jax's blood ran cold. She'll find out eventually, his father continued. And when she does, you won't just lose her trust. You'll lose her for good. The line went dead. Jax stood there, staring at the phone, his heart pounding. He had made a mistake. He had let Celeste go to protect her. But if his father was right, if the truth was going to catch up to him anyway, then maybe letting her go had been the worst mistake of all. 2 weeks passed. Celeste had spent most of them trying to survive. She got a waitressing job at a small cafe downtown. The work was exhausting, and the pay was nothing compared to what she was used to, but it was hers. She rented a tiny apartment with thin walls and an old mattress, but for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was living in someone else's shadow. She was making it on her own. But no matter how busy she kept herself, she couldn't shake the thoughts of Jax. She told herself she hated him, that she was done, that she had moved on. But late at night, when she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she knew the truth. She still loved him, and she hated herself for it. One evening, after a long shift at the cafe, Celeste was wiping down tables when a man walked in. At first, she barely glanced up, but the moment she did, her heart stopped. He was tall, well-dressed, with the kind of presence that made the room feel smaller. His sharp, calculating eyes scanned the cafe before landing on her. And he smirked. Celeste Montgomery, he said smoothly, stepping toward her. You're a hard woman to find. Her pulse quickened. Who are you? I'm someone who knows Jackson Carter very well. Her blood ran cold. And I think it's time you learned who he really is. Celeste gripped the rag in her hands, her knuckles turning white. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, forcing her voice to stay calm. The man chuckled, taking a slow step toward her. "Oh, I think you do." There was something about him, his confidence, the way he carried himself, that set her on edge. He wasn't just some stranger. He was dangerous. "What do you want?" she demanded. He tilted his head. "To help you." She let out a sharp laugh. "I don't need your help. Don't you?" The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table toward her. "You walked away from your family thinking you knew the truth. But Jackson Carter? He's been lying to you from the start." Celeste's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled as she picked up the paper and unfolded it. It was a newspaper clipping, an old one. The headline made her stomach drop. "Criminal Dynasty: The Fall of the Carter Empire." Her eyes darted over the words, scanning the article. The Carter family, once one of the most powerful underground organizations in the city, collapsed after the arrest of their leader, James Carter. His empire, built on corruption and illegal dealings, left behind a legacy of betrayal and enemies. His eldest son, Jackson Carter, disappeared from the public eye years ago, rumored to be severing ties with his family's past, though sources suggest the truth is far more complicated. Celeste's heart pounded in her chest. She looked up, her vision blurring. This can't be right." "Oh, it's very real," the man said smoothly. "Jax isn't just some mechanic. He's the son of a criminal mastermind. And you?"
He smirked.
"You were just his latest game." The words hit her like a slap. Jax had always been secretive about his past. He had always dodged questions, always kept her at arm's length.
Now she knew why.
She forced herself to meet the stranger's gaze. "Why are you telling me this?" He shrugged. "Because I know what happens to people who get too close to the Carters. And I don't think you want to be next." Her hands clenched into fists. "Stay away from me." The man just chuckled and turned to leave. But just as he reached the door, he paused. "You should ask him yourself, Celeste. See if he's willing to tell you the truth. If you still believe he loves you after that, well." He gave her one last smirk. "Good luck." The bell above the cafe door jingled as he walked out, leaving her standing there, her world spinning. Jax had lied to her. Again. And this time, she wasn't sure she could forgive him. Celeste didn't wait. She stormed out of the cafe, barely remembering to grab her jacket. She didn't even care that she had left her shift early. There was only one thing on her mind. She needed answers. By the time she reached Jax's garage, her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. The place was quiet, the neon sign flickering above the entrance. She didn't bother knocking. She shoved the door open and stepped inside. Jax was there, leaning over a car, his hands covered in oil. When he saw her, his expression shifted, surprise, then something else. Something wary. "Celeste." He wiped his hands on a rag, stepping toward her. "What are you doing here?"
She didn't hesitate.
She threw the newspaper clipping at his chest. "Explain this," she demanded. Jax caught the paper, frowning as he unfolded it. The second his eyes landed on the headline, his entire body stiffened. "Where did you get this?" His voice was lower now, guarded. "Does it matter?" she snapped. "Is it true?" Silence. Jax clenched his jaw. "Celeste. Don't you dare lie to me." She cut him off. "I walked away from everything for you. I trusted you. And the whole time, you were keeping this from me." His hands curled into fists. "I didn't tell you, because I knew how you'd react." "Oh, so I wasn't even worth the truth?" Her voice cracked, but she refused to cry. "You let me think my family were the only ones playing games, when you were doing the same damn thing." Jax ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "I was never playing games with you, Celeste. I never wanted you to get dragged into this. But I am." She gestured to the paper. "Because of you." His eyes darkened. "I left that life behind. Then why is someone showing up at my job, warning me to stay away from you?" Jax froze. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Finally he spoke. "Who?" "I don't know. Some rich-looking guy with a smug face and an attitude." Her voice was bitter. "He seemed to know a lot about you. About your family." Jax cursed under his breath, his whole body tense. "So it's true," she whispered. "Yes." He met her eyes, his voice raw. "It's true. My father was a criminal. I grew up in his world, and I spent years trying to get out. I changed my name. I built a new life. But I didn't tell you, because I knew if I did, you'd leave." Celeste let out a hollow laugh. "So, you decided to lie instead?" Jax stepped toward her, but she held up a hand. "Don't." Pain flickered across his face. "Celeste, please. I love you." Her heart clenched. She wanted to believe him. But how could she, when he had spent their entire relationship keeping this from her? She shook her head. "I can't do this, Jax." "Celeste."
No.
Her voice was firm, even as her heart shattered. "I gave up everything for you. And all I asked for in return was the truth. But you couldn't even give me that." Jax's jaw tightened, his eyes filled with something desperate. "It was never about not trusting you. I was trying to protect you. You don't get to decide that for me." Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Goodbye, Jax." And this time, she was the one who walked away. Celeste spent the next few days convincing herself she had done the right thing. She had walked away. She had chosen herself. Then why did it still feel like she was drowning? She kept busy with work, ignoring the nagging ache in her chest every time she passed a black motorcycle on the street. She forced herself not to check her phone, not to wonder if Jax had tried to reach out. It didn't matter anymore. At least, that's what she told herself. Until the world decided to prove her wrong. It happened late one night after her shift. The streets were quiet, the only sound the soft hum of streetlights buzzing above. She had just turned the corner toward her apartment when she noticed the black car parked near the curb. A man leaned against it, waiting. Her stomach twisted. She recognized him immediately. The same man who had come into the cafe. Her feet slowed. He smiled. "I was hoping we'd run into each other again." Celeste's heart pounded. "What do you want?" "I told you before. I was trying to help you." He pushed off the car, stepping closer. "But you didn't believe me. So, I figured I'd give you a little more motivation." Her fists clenched. "I don't want anything from you." "Oh, I think you'll want this." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. She didn't take it. "I'm not playing your games." "It's not a game, Celeste." He smirked. "It's a hospital record." The breath left her lungs. Jackson Carter was admitted last night. A car accident. Her world tilted. What? Someone ran him off the road. Pretty bad crash. He's lucky to be alive. The man tilted his head. But I wonder, does he even have anyone left who cares? Celeste didn't wait to hear another word. She ran. The moment she burst through the hospital doors, her pulse was a deafening roar in her ears. "Jackson Carter," she gasped at the nurse behind the desk. "Where is he?" The woman hesitated. "Are you family?" "Yes." The lie slipped out so fast, she didn't even think about it. The nurse must have seen the desperation in her eyes, because she sighed and nodded. "Room 307. Celeste took off down the hall, her legs shaking. When she pushed open the door, her breath caught. Jax lay in the hospital bed, his face pale, a bruise darkening his cheekbone. His arm was wrapped in a sling, and bandages covered his forehead. She had never seen him look so vulnerable. A choked sob escaped her throat. Jax's eyes fluttered open. When he saw her, something flickered in his gaze, relief. "Celeste." His voice was rough, like he had been through hell. She rushed to his side, gripping his uninjured hand. "You idiot." A weak chuckle left his lips. "Missed you too." Tears burned her eyes. "What happened?" His expression darkened. "It wasn't an accident." Her heart clenched. "Who?" He exhaled slowly. "My past is catching up to me. And now it's coming for you, too." A shiver ran down her spine. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Celeste sat stiffly on the velvet chaise in her father's study, her hands clenched in her lap. The grand chandelier above cast a golden glow, but the warmth in the room was non-existent. Her mother stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, her expression carved from ice. Her father sat behind his mahogany desk, fingers steepled together, his sharp eyes drilling into her. Across the room, her older brother, Nathan, leaned against the door, shaking his head in disapproval. This was an ambush. "This is the last time we're having this conversation, Celeste," her father said, his voice slow and deliberate, the way he spoke before delivering a verdict in the boardroom. "End whatever this is with that mechanic." Celeste lifted her chin, refusing to cower. "His name is Jax, and I love him." Her mother scoffed. "Love? Celeste, be serious. You've known him for, what, a few months? You have no idea who he truly is. Men like him," she waved a dismissive hand. "They see a girl like you and know exactly what to say to make you feel special." Her father leaned forward. "And what does he have to offer you, Celeste? A life in a dingy apartment? A future filled with unpaid bills and hard labor? That is not the life we raised you for." "Maybe I don't want the life you raised me for," Celeste shot back, her voice shaking with frustration. "Maybe I don't want to be paraded around at charity galas and sold off to the highest bidder. Maybe I want something real." "Real?" Nathan scoffed, stepping away from the door. "Celeste, you don't know what real is. You've never had to work a day in your life. You've never even had to pour your own coffee." She flinched at the truth of his words, but refused to back down. "And whose fault is that? I was never given a choice. You shaped me into the perfect heiress, and now you're angry that I want something different." Her father sighed, rubbing his temple.
We are not angry, Celeste.
"We are disappointed. You are throwing away everything for a fantasy." "It's not a fantasy," she snapped. "Jax works hard. He may not come from money, but at least he's honest. At least I know he sees me as a person, not as an asset." Her mother's lips curled in disdain. "Honest? And what do you think he sees when he looks at you? A beautiful, spoiled little heiress who can give him a life he could never have on his own." Celeste's stomach twisted. "You don't know him, and you do," Nathan challenged. "You think he loves you for you? Or do you think he loves the idea of Celeste Montgomery, the woman who can change his life overnight?" She felt her resolve waver, but she forced herself to stay strong. "If that were true, don't you think he'd be asking me for money? For help?" Her father exhaled sharply, clearly losing patience. "Celeste, listen carefully. If you walk away from this family for him, you will have nothing. No inheritance. No financial support. No home. Do you understand?" Her mother added coldly, "And don't come crawling back when it falls apart." Celeste's hands trembled. The weight of their ultimatum settled over her, crushing, suffocating. But when she closed her eyes, she saw Jax, his lopsided smirk, the way he brushed oil from his hands before touching her face, the way he made her feel alive. She took a shaky breath. "I don't want your money. I don't want your approval," she said, voice steadier than she felt. "If being part of this family means giving up the person I love, then I don't want to be a Montgomery anymore." A thick silence filled the room. Her father's chair scraped against the floor as he stood, his face unreadable. "Then you're no longer my daughter." Her mother turned away without another word, as if dismissing her from existence. Nathan let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through his hair. "Damn it, Celeste. Don't do this." But she already had. Celeste pushed herself to her feet, her knees threatening to give way beneath her, but she forced herself to stay strong. Without another glance at the family she had spent her whole life trying to please, she turned and walked out the door. She had chosen love. Now, she had to find out if love had chosen her back. Celeste stayed by Jax's side that night, refusing to leave. She should have walked away. She had tried. But the second she saw him bruised and broken, everything else faded.
The past.
The lies. The heartbreak. None of it mattered. Because no matter how much he had hurt her, she still loved him. And she wasn't ready to lose him. Jax's fingers tightened around hers. "Celeste." His voice was weak, but steady. "You shouldn't be here. I'm exactly where I need to be. You don't understand." His jaw clenched. "They won't stop. The people after me, They won't care who gets hurt. Her heart pounded. Then we face them together. Jax shook his head. You don't deserve this life. I don't care. She leaned in, her voice firm. You asked me to trust you, even when you didn't trust me with the truth. Now I'm asking you, do you love me, Jax? His breath hitched. You know I do. Then stop pushing me away. Silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Jax exhaled. I tried to protect you by keeping you away. His eyes darkened. But I see it now. You're not someone who needs protecting. Celeste squeezed his hand.
No.
I'm someone who fights for what I love. A ghost of a smile crossed his lips. I don't deserve you. Too bad. She smirked, her voice soft. You're stuck with me. For the first time in days, Jax relaxed. Okay. She frowned. Okay. We do this together. 1 month later, Jax recovered faster than the doctors expected. And Celeste? She made her choice. She walked away from the life of wealth and privilege, from her family's expectations. She chose Jax. It wasn't easy. His past still lingered, shadows of danger always on the edges. But he wasn't alone anymore. And neither was she. They rebuilt. Together. A new home. A new life. A new future. And for the first time, Celeste didn't feel trapped. She felt free. With Jax by her side, she had everything she ever needed.
Love.
A life of her own making. And a future she had chosen for herself.